Gen Z has changed the ride-sharing world in a couple of different ways. And this is a very interesting thing to bring up because as you can imagine, as time goes on, the waters when it comes to Uber and Lyft, and might as well even say this, being an Uber driver and a Lyft driver, are getting more rough than ever before. As a side note, I'm gonna say, I'm filming in a new area. Let me know what you think when it comes to like the lighting, the sound, all that kind of stuff. Like I'm testing out like a new filming area basically. But getting into this video, to kind of jump into some statistics, which is really interesting. In case you didn't know, Gen Z is actually using Uber and Lyft or ride sharing more than millennials. I think that's really interesting. And it's kind of funny being a millennial, and I've seen some memes about this where when you grew up as a millennial, you're like, okay, don't meet strangers on the internet, don't get in strangers' cars. And then Tinder came out or Hinge, and then Uber and Lyft came out and said, hey, meet people on the internet. Get in strangers' cars, right? So it's kind of ironic, but I think with Uber and Lyft becoming so normalized now, it makes sense that Gen Z is using it more than millennials are. So on one end, that's actually good, and that's an actual statistic. In addition to that, which I also think is very interesting, and this is something I'm gonna bring up a lot in this video, which is an important point to start at, statistically speaking now, Gen Z is also driving more than millennials. That's kind of surprising to me. In some ways it is, in some ways it isn't, but I think that's something to be aware of. So in some ways, Gen Z is basically using more transportation, or in all ways, or most ways, than millennials. Now that's a big thing because as you can imagine, as the years go on, as we're approaching like say the tail end of the 2020s, I think it's interesting because when you look at Uber and Lyft, I've talked a lot about the good things that are happening with drivers, the legal stuff that's going on, unions, there's a lot of positive things happening for drivers. Also some negative. And I just did a big video about the number one reason why when it comes to 2026, the number one reason why I think it's gonna be very difficult and very cutthroat and bad for drivers. And that is too little rides to go around. It's a very finite amount of rides, and with self-driving cars and a lot of other factors that I have talked about in that video, it's gonna be harder and harder for drivers to get rides, which means it's gonna be harder to make ends meet. And I think when you look at future generations using Uber and Lyft, there's two interesting things that I think are going on that are almost paradoxical, but also bring up a big issue. One, yes, Gen Z is using Uber and Lyft than ever before, especially compared to millennials. And in addition, and I've mentioned this in a lot of videos, statistically speaking, there are more rides happening for Uber and Lyft every day. Every day there's more and more rides happening. So this is good. On the other end, I do feel like the rate of increase is starting to slow down. And like I mentioned, statistically speaking, Gen Z now drives more than millennials. And I'm not talking about like Ubers and Lyfts, I'm talking about driving. So it's interesting that you have these two almost opposing things happening at the same time. Gen Z is driving more than millennials, but also they're using Uber and Lyft more than millennials. I do think this is what's going on. And I think this is a big thing, and that is Gen Z not drinking as much. I mentioned this in that past video, and I've not really talked about this in a lot of videos, but I know it's a weird point to bring up when it comes to drugs or drug use. And I know it's a weird thing, but this is very relevant for all my drivers out there because I think what's going on is one, Uber and Lyft is such an ingrained part of our society. Like I remember even in 2012, even just 10 years ago, never hearing about Uber and Lyft, or excuse me, 13 years ago, never hearing about Uber and Lyft, getting taxis in Boston. It was a nightmare to get around. And then I think the first time I took a ride was in 2014. Then I started driving as a driver in 2015. And it's crazy looking at how, I can't have, maybe besides the iPhone, I can't really think of any company or companies that change the landscape of the world that fast. Within the past 5 or 10 years, ride sharing's everywhere. I mean, imagine if Lyft and Uber went away tomorrow. Imagine if ride sharing disappeared. It would be a huge hit to our economy, the way people get around, whether you're going out to work, whether you don't have a car, whether you're trying to get groceries, like say you're elderly, handicapped, or disabled, and it's hard for you to get transportation, even just, which is the most typical example, going out on a Friday night for drinks, and you want to be safe and responsible. And I say this because I think what's interesting about Gen Z, and I'm very curious to see how this plays out, is in case you didn't know, Gen Z is drinking way less than any generation in history. Not by a little bit, but by a lot. The way Gen Z views drinking is kind of the same way that millennials view smoking. It is heavily going down in terms of drinking. And in addition to, a lot of Gen Zers, if I were like that, are staying in, aren't really going out. So my theory is the reason why Gen Z is using Uber and Lyft more than millennials is just because they grew up with it. It's kind of like if I said if I had to guess who uses the internet more, like boomers or millennials or whatever. Like it makes sense they grew up with it. So to them, Uber and Lyft is their common space. Uber and Lyft is just part of society. As a millennial, I remember no Uber and Lyft, and then I remember, of course, Uber and Lyft. But to a lot of, let's say, Gen Zers, they just grew up with it. So that makes sense. But I think a big thing, the reason why I think Gen Z is driving more, and I've mentioned this, is that if they are going to go out, they're not drinking. A lot of them maybe are just being sober, maybe looking for sober alternatives. A lot of them are smoking weed, and I don't condone this, but I want to say a lot of people have this mindset that drinking and driving is bad. You should not drink and drive, of course. But if you smoke and drive, which again, I'm still against, but if you smoke and drive, it's better. A lot of people who smoke, who are big marijuana users, have the sensation that, hey, if anything, I drive better. That's a very common perspective. So I think a lot of people in Gen Z are saying, hey, I don't drink. So if I'm going to go out, I'm actually going to drive myself. So I'm not going to take an Uber and Lyft. And I do feel like as time goes on, this is something that is going to affect Ubers and Lyfts being taken more and more for too many reasons. Like I said, one, not drinking. So a lot of Gen Zers, whether they're sober, whether they're smoking marijuana, whether they're doing other things, are willing to drive themselves because they feel like they're able to drive. And of course, they're not consuming alcohol, which means they can't drive if they were consuming alcohol. The second thing is Gen Z is going out way less than millennials. And I think that's another big factor too, that we look at Gen Z going out way less than millennials. You're talking about way less rides for people to take, way less rides that Gen Z is taking. And it does kind of make sense. I use this analogy, or not analogy, but example that drink prices right now are absurd. Ubers and Lyfts, I'll be honest, are absurd. And when you look at how expensive things are getting versus how much money you're making, it is crazy. And a lot of Gen Zers are saying, wait, why would I go out? Like, why would I spend literally 1 hour's worth of work for one bottom shelf vodka drink at the bar to get a buzz for an hour and be like, ooh, and now I can't drive, which means I have to get more Ubers and Lyfts. Like going out in LA, it's not uncommon to easily spend $100 like that. And if you're like minimum wage, like say minimum wage being like 17 an hour, let's just raise it to 20 for numbers sake to make it easy. You're looking at 5 hours of work to go out for a random night to a dive. I mean, it's not uncommon if I go to a dive bar here in LA with Ubers and Lyfts. And dive bars are supposed to be cheap. You're talking about very, very cheap drinks. Not uncommon to easily spend 50 or $60. So you're telling me I have to work multiple hours just to go to a random dive bar where the floor is almost like sticky and I get some cheap Bud Light on tap? Like Gen Z is saying, what is the point? And I gotta be honest, I kind of get it. I guess I was reading this report now that Blackout Wednesday, at the time of this video, it's about to be Thanksgiving. So happy early Thanksgiving, everybody. That Blackout Wednesday, the night before Thanksgiving, where a lot of people used to go out, have drinks, blah, 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 isn't really a thing anymore, Gen Z, because they don't care about drinking. In addition, Gen Z is staying in more than ever before. I say all these things because it seems like a random side tangent, random side point, but this equals one thing that I feel like, although yes, Gen Z is taking more Ubers and Lyfts, I do predict that as time goes on, the usage of Uber and Lyft is going to decrease a lot. And I'm not trying to blame Gen Z. I'm actually a huge fan of Gen Z, massively, like absolutely huge a fan of Gen Z. But I think it does make a lot of sense that Gen Z doesn't want to, drink. So they might just drive themselves if they do happen to go out, and then two, they don't even want to go out at all. So the rate of Ubers and Lyfts being used, like say on a Friday, Saturday night, is decreasing. A lot of Gen Zers are saying, just what's the point? And then in addition, I combine this with Waymo, that maybe to a lot of Gen Zers, they're saying like, oh, well, Uber and Lyft is kind of becoming sounds kind of crazy to say because it's how fast things move. Uber and Lyft might be looked at now as almost like a older technology, which I know it sounds really weird to word like that, but I think Gen Z is more willing to adapt a Waymo or to take a Waymo than millennials are because it's a newer piece of technology. Maybe they trust it more, et cetera, et cetera. And then if you look at Gen Alpha, which is years down the road from taking a Waymo, I think the combination of the not going out, not drinking, and self-driving cars becoming more prevalent means that Gen Z, I think in general, over time, I think start taking Ubers and Lyfts less and less and less. And as a result of that, I do predict that by 2030, at the end of 2025 right now, so we have about 4 years left until the end of this decade, I do predict that Uber and Lyft, I think, is going to start to fall off. And I know that sounds crazy, and I'm not trying to scare any drivers, but I've mentioned this in a few videos that in the past 3 to 4 years, every so often I do a video about where's Uber and Lyft going? And in addition, might as well even say this, should any drivers be worried about your job being, whether it's taken over by robots or self-driving cars? Will you even have a job anymore? Blah, blah, blah. And I will say this, that there's still a lot of tricky things going on. I still think Uber and Lyft will be around for a long time. Don't get me wrong, but I feel like the way people are viewing Uber and Lyft now when it comes to going out and everything isn't the way it used to be. And I do think, I hate to say it, it is going to be a hit to drivers because let's be honest, not only when it comes to just getting rides or driving, you want to make the most amount of money you can. That's why you're working, right? You're like, hey, that's why you watch all these pro tip videos. I've done a bunch of videos, how to make more money driving for Uber and Lyft, the best times to drive, hacks or tricks or tips in the apps, et cetera, et cetera. And when you look at what's going on, I think it is an unfortunate thing that the best times to drive, or used to be able to drive, to make the most amount of money, was Friday and Saturday nights. Yes, morning and evening commutes I think will always be a thing, but Friday and Saturday nights are really the pockets, the time you can make the most amount of money. In addition, most people drive for Uber and Lyft as a secondary job. So they're saying, drive on a Friday night, because I typically work Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. I'm gonna drive on a Friday night to make extra ends meet, to make side cash, et cetera, et cetera. But then when you look at what's happening with the current landscape and the algorithmic nature, if I call it like that, of just how Uber and Lyft is being used, the socio-economic climate, all these technical words equal one thing. Friday nights are not Friday nights anymore. People don't want to go out and drink. People would rather either not go out at all or drive themselves. And with all these coming into play, that means there's less and less rides, I think, for Uber and Lyft drivers in general. And this has already been an issue since 2023, like I've talked about. Just with it being harder and harder to get a ride, there's too many drivers on the road. So you're talking about way less people taking Ubers and Lyfts, say on a Friday night. And there being too many drivers on the road, which means there's less rides to go around. And then you combine this with self-driving cars like Waymos, and most people right now, love it or hate it, are preferring to take a Waymo rather than Uber or Lyft. All this stuff is equaling just not a good landscape. And again, I want to stress on this video, I'm not trying to blame Gen Z. I'm not trying to be Gen Z's doing this. I get it. I get that the minimum wage, say in your area, the minimum wage here in California is about $17, but I think countrywide it's still $8 or $9. So let's say if you live in a rural area and you're getting paid, I don't know, let's say $9 an hour, you might have to work an hour just to take one Uber to go out. And it's a lot of people are just looking at this as an ROI perspective. Why spend so much money to go to a bar to get drunk, to wake up hungover? Again, and on top of all this, like I said, Gen Z just doesn't care about drinking as much. And I'm not saying they should. I'm not saying we have to bring drinking back, so to speak. What I'm saying is this is just something to be aware of, that with Gen Z driving more than millennials, with Gen Z drinking less than millennials, and all these different things come into play, the peak hours, especially on Friday and Saturday nights, are just not the way they used to be. And I think this is something to be aware of, that as time goes on and the future is becoming more and more here, that the landscape when it comes to being a rideshare driver is changing heavily. And I hate to say it, for better or for worse, with self-driving cars and everything, with people drinking less, in some ways that's a good thing. I think self-driving cars have been shown to be safer than humans. People drinking less, I think that's also, of course, a good thing. Alcohol is one of the worst things you can put into your body. Andrew Huberman's talked about this, where the max amount people can have is 2 drinks a week. Not a day, but a week. Anything past 2 drinks a week, severe health benefits. Excuse me, severe health, issues, right? Definitely not benefits. And if you think about it, a lot of people say, wait, 2 drinks a week is the max? Anything past that, it's dangerous for me? Yeah, so I think in some ways this is good that Gen Z is being healthier, better, smarter, et cetera, more financially responsible, because they kind of have to be because of the economy. But on the other end, when we look at how this is affecting drivers, not looking the best.